came across an article just the other day and it absolutely blew my mind. Have a look at these. These are the walls, Roman walls, still standing here at the long abandoned town of Caliva Atrebatum. In fact, after the Romans left, this town was abandoned, never to be used again. There was one thing that I never really understood about these walls. It turns out that these walls are really durable. What's left of the walls, it hasn't been robbed out over the last 1600 years or so, but 1600 years on, we have a really hard concrete in between this flint. But it turns out that wasn't the only fascinating thing. It turns out that these walls are actually self-healing. Welcome to the top 4 Roman technologies you may or may not have heard of. Now, if you know anything about your Roman history, you'll know they were pretty efficient with water, not least the aqueducts. Now, even here in the provinces, well, there's reputed to be up to a dozen, one of which at least you can still go and see today down in Dorchester. It skirts its way through the landscape up a valley about 8 or 10 miles or so. Yep, video to follow. However, aqueducts were one thing, but that was the tip of the iceberg when it came to general water management from the Romans. We know they had water wheels from the 1st century BC. From the writings of Strabo and Vitruvius, we know they had undershot water wheels. There are 1 or 2 poems, in fact, which, in one way or another, talk of overshot wheels and how they aided the work of women servants within the mill. That was all very early Roman era and the evidence wasn't great, the physical evidence even less so. However, when they did find physical evidence, goodness me, it was quite something. Late 2nd, early 3rd century, we have an installation in Barbagel, south of France. This was a structure that contained 8 pairs of water wheels and was in use for around 100 years. This flour mill could produce 4.5 tons per day, sustaining a population of over 10,000 inhabitants. You might be thinking a discussion like this about Roman technology making things a lot better for the people. The 16 water wheels serving a town of 10,000 people. Well, life was a breeze. And that was even backed up here in the UK because under the city of York in 1972 a Roman sewer was found. And that's when things start to take a bit of a nasty turn. So back in 1972, and even after 1500 years or so of being out of use, they found tiny white, almost fibre-like fragments. But it turned out that these confirmed what we already knew from writings of historians at the time. The Romans would use marine sponges stuck on a stick as a form of toilet paper. Now, the sewers themselves were big enough to allow presumably slaves to walk through, but those sewers told us a tale or two. According to Linda Gigate of Louisiana University, disease in most Roman cities, Rome included, was rife. This York sewer confirmed this. The residents of York were riddled with worms and bowel parasites. So with water we do have some fascinating technologies, and I could have gone on and mentioned quite a few more, not least agricultural irrigation, for example. So let's get things a bit more positive. Okay, so I've left the Roman town of Silchester. We'll be back there later for this particular technology. There's something I need to show you at the top of the hill just up there. Now, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you'll know I've kind of struggled with the whole principle of Romans building a straight line, because if you pop onto Google and you tap away, well, all it says is they use the groma. Now, the groma is essentially like a long staff, for want of a better word. It's got some like a cross at the top, of which some plumb lines hang down from. And the principle is, well, you can line up straight lines using these gromas at set intervals. And I've always kind of struggled with that. From beacon to beacon, yes, that could work. But there's a number of other questions that don't really add up with that in mind. How do you go from beacon to beacon to beacon? How do you know which direction you're setting off in? There's a lot of question marks around that principle. But when we get to the top of the hill, I should be able to explain to you now exactly how that technology is so much better than what I first envisaged. So I came across some work by Isaac Marino Gallo. Isaac in 2004 proposed something that involved this mystery. Not only did he agree that the Groma has never had a role in the layout of roads, as is often laid out in modern texts, but instead they relied on triangulation. Now naively I thought that was a Ordnance Survey thing, late 1700s, the need to map Britain, William Roy, the later triangulation of Great Britain, but it turns out the Romans had this covered a long time before that, perhaps riding on the back of the technology of some of the Greeks. Okay, I think we're at the point now where I was going to show you the thing. We might even need to dive into this hedge just here. So Isaac suggested that, like any good surveyor, well, if you want to understand the elevation, the distances between hills and such, well, you'd need to draw a map. Any good surveyor would, he suggests. That seems sort of staggering, although it shouldn't be to me, that Romans had maps to do this work. Right, just down here. So Isaac highlights that with the map in hand, triangulation would now take place. Now they did not use contours, so the mystery remains of how they expressed height. They would then use surveying poles and a diopter to measure the angles and altitudes. For further precision on individual slopes, an inclinometer would be used. Now I'm not going to waffle on about this too much. Perhaps it's more obvious to you than it is to me, but to me this is quite the fascination. To understand the Romans did have sort of basic triangulation equipment meant that they could draw the rudimentary map, and they would mark every high point, every different elevation, every feature on the landscape that they could possibly use to draw triangles between point A and point B, and therefore you knew exactly what direction you'd need to head in based on your map and based on the degrees difference between those features. Now I did promise you that I was going to show you something quite spectacular, let's say, and it's what I've been walking on for the last couple of minutes. This is, I wish it would come out on camera better than it actually does. This is the Roman road between Silchester, Margary Route 4 I think, down to Salisbury, Dorchester and beyond. Sometime in the mid-1st century BC, a merchant ship, likely caught in a storm, capsized. It was carrying something like 250 to 300 tons of goods. Nearly 2,000 years on, the wreckage and some of its cargo would be retrieved. It would take a further year before one specific object within this cargo would be identified. That object is now considered the most sophisticated scientific artefact that survives from antiquity. Now this object is referred to as a clockwork mechanical calculator, and it was said to have at least 32 gears when it was found. It was likely it was going to be housed in a wooden box. Obviously that part didn't survive. It was then broken down by a team into 82 separate parts to try and conserve it better and understand exactly what this thing was. Nothing like this that we know of would be constructed again for 1,000 years. This really was quite the story, not least the computer itself, but also the recovery mission in 1900. Bear in mind, this was quite a deep shipwreck. So the object had 37 gear wheels, pointers, scales, inscriptions, concentric dials. It was like nothing ever seen before. So the gearing and the front was made of bronze, and as suggested, probably in a wooden casing with a handle on the side. With 100 years of research and modern x-rays of the object, we can now determine what its use was. You would operate it by turning the handle on the side, and it would tell you everything about the night sky at a particular moment in time, the position of the sun, the moon, and possibly the planets. On the front disc there are tiny reference letters too. Now as the date point gets to one of these, it is telling you what stars are rising and what stars are setting. But that was just the front. On the back we have recently discovered two spiral dials. The top is a 235-month repeating calendar. Now bizarrely, also on the back it had a smaller dial, and this was thought to elongate somehow the calendars. But it turned out this was actually a 4-yearly event, and it marked the Greek Games, the Olympics. And it even gave us the names of those games. This was of huge social importance as well, it seems. But what about the bottom spiral? So it turned out to be a 223-month cycle and turned out to be an eclipse prediction cycle. So this was a hugely important mathematical, navigational, agricultural, social object that was found, and it's the only one that we've found to date, which is quite staggering in itself. It was found on a trade ship. What was it doing on there? I feel there may be a lot more to come on this, perhaps one day in the future. Okay, so at the start of the video I teased you with the Roman concrete in the vain hope to keep you watching and keep the retention nice and high. If you're still here watching, well done, you deserve a treat in the form of Roman concrete. Self-healing Roman concrete, in fact. During 2010s, researchers from MIT Harvard University set about the task of identifying why Roman concrete was so durable. There was a massive assumption which hadn't been challenged for decades, that being the concrete was made using pozzolanic material like ash from near the Bay of Naples. Historians at the time, like Vitruvius, suggested this material was shipped across the empire and used for all aspects of construction. Now, the team at Harvard noticed one particular feature about the concrete that stuck in their minds. It was tiny white clasts, about 1 millimetre in diameter. Now, the assumption was this was just poor quality control in mixing this concrete, but that in itself doesn't sound very Roman. You see, prior to this, there was an assumption of how this was made, and that was that lime was mixed with water to make a highly reactive paste-like material. That was known as slacking, but that never accounted for these tiny white clasts. Instead of this, it turned out that the white clasts features were instead produced at extremely high temperatures, forming quicklime instead of or as well as the slacked lime. So this was known as hot mixing, but it would allow not only for a chemical cross-linking but also super quick curing time, allowing for a more efficient construction time, of course. Problem solved, but it didn't stop there, because during this hot mixing process these lime clasts became brittle and developed into a reactive calcium source. When tiny cracks from within the concrete appear, well, this reactive calcium source can travel through those cracks and it can reactivate with water. That was absolutely staggering. That meant that if any cracks or gaps appeared in these walls, in principle, well, they would just simply re-heal themselves. It didn't need any touch-up or repair work as such. 1700 years on, here we are now, and what's left of these walls are very strong. A little bit of erosion's gone on there, but the Romans invented self-healing concrete. It's quite phenomenal. If you like this type of content, I'd love it if you click subscribe and like, and of course we've got a load of videos in a playlist you can watch, probably there if not there. Thanks for watching, we'll see you this time next week.